Hello, I'm Ethan Higgins, and this is episode 2 of the Spanish Civil War podcast. Last episode, we looked at a condensed history of Spain from the Roman conquest of Iberia all the way to the early 20th century. I ended that episode in the 1920s, with Miguel Primo de Rivera declaring a pronunciamiento in response to the rapidly deteriorating situation in Spain. Before we resume, I think it is important to thoroughly establish the extent of the crisis that faced the country, as well as examine the political groups that threatened the existing order. While socialists, such as the PSOE and their affiliated unions, like the UGT, sought to achieve their goals through generally legitimate means, the anarchists consistently deployed violence with the hopes of creating independent, autonomous communes throughout the country. From 1897 to 1921, numerous acts of political violence were carried out by radical leftists against government officials. The era saw the deaths of dozens of civilians and politicians alike, along with 3 assassinations of prime ministers and 3 attempts on King Alfonso XIII's life. Many of Spain's larger cities saw public order utterly break down, as gangs of criminals exploited the situation to rob and commit acts of violence with virtual impunity. Barcelona became a war zone as anarchist militias regularly launched attacks on police stations and government offices. As mentioned in the last episode, matters abroad were not much better, as the Spanish army in Morocco struggled to suppress the insurrection of Abdul al-Karim. When the Cortes tried to increase conscription while simultaneously heaping verbal abuse on the army, the socialists declared a national strike that brought industry to a crawl across Spain. Now that we have a good idea of the crisis that faced Spain, I can introduce Miguel Primo de Rivera, who is one of the main subjects of today's episode. Miguel Primo de Rivera was born on January 8th, 1870, in Jerez, a town located in Andalusia on the southern end of Spain. An aristocrat born into a family with an extensive history of military service, he joined the officer corps at a young age and spent most of his formative years in the army fighting the Rif tribes of southern Morocco. By 1923, he had reached the rank of captain general and was stationed in Barcelona, where he watched the situation rapidly deteriorate. As mentioned in the previous episode, Spain throughout the 19th century had established a precedent of military leaders assuming state power during times of political turmoil. These figures, often referred to as caudillos, would dismantle the government, resolve the crisis, and then reconstitute a new government composed of civilians. So when Primo de Rivera issued his pronunciamiento that called for a change in government, it was initially met with a great deal of public support. Following his pronunciamiento in September of 1923, the king gave his assent, allowing Miguel to form a national directorate. After dissolving the Cortes and suspending the constitution, Primo de Rivera initiated a massive crackdown on all organizations and leaders responsible for the recent waves of lawlessness. According to the Captain General, his seizure of power would only represent a, quote, brief parenthesis in the history of Spanish parliamentary government. As we shall see later in this episode, this parenthesis would be greatly extended and inaugurated the first real dictatorship in Spanish history. Having ushered in his new regime without initial royal approval, Miguel's pronouncement also threatened to weaken the authority of the monarchy. Dissolving both the liberal and conservative parties, Miguel Primo de Rivera formed his own political organization, El Unión Patriótica. The Patriotic Union was composed of a mix of civilians and military officials from across the political spectrum, ranging from monarchists to even a few socialists. Faced with crippling strikes across the country that brought industry to a halt, Miguel negotiated with moderate union organizers while outlawing more radical anarchist unions like the CNT. Driven underground, several members of the CNT split off to form their own more violent anarcho-socialist group known as El Federación Anarquista Ibérica, or the Iberian Anarchist Federation, from here on referred to as the FAI. While some of the Captain General's policies helped politically center the country by creating a broad selection of moderates, other actions taken by his regime served to further polarize Spain. When he proclaimed publicly that he would not support regional autonomy, many of those in Catalonia and the Basque Country who had initially supported the regime were alienated. While we are on the subject of Catalonia and the Basque Country, this gives me the perfect opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of the two regions. Though each region of Spain has its own rich and unique history in their own right, these two deserve our attention for later developments in the series as we progress towards the Civil War. Located in the northeast of Spain, Catalonia has historically contained the provinces of Barcelona, Coruña, Lleida, and Tarragona. Over several centuries, the people of the region developed their own dialect called Catalan, which took influence from the languages of the peoples of southern France and northern Spain. The origin of Catalonia as a distinct political entity effectively began in the 8th century, when the Franks established it as a buffer fiefdom against Moorish encroachment. When Ramon Berenguer, the Counts of Barcelona, the then leading city of Catalonia, married Petronila of Aragon in 1137, the region began to increase its influence. Under the rule of their grandson, Jaime I, the Conqueror, the Muslims were driven out of Valencia and the Balearic Isles. Catalonia joined the Kingdom of the Spains through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon, their liege, and Isabella of Castile in 1469. As mentioned in the previous episode, though all the Spains shared the same ruler, they each retained many of their specific customs, rights, and governments as they had before the marriage. This arrangement between Catalonia and the royal family in Madrid changed after the War of Spanish Succession. Upon securing his reign after the conflict in 1714, King Philip V abolished the ancient rights of Catalonia, since they had sided with his rival during the war. Many historians believe this dissolution of Catalonia's political status helped lay the groundwork for Catalonian nationalism. While over the next few centuries there were several regionalist insurrections, these were limited to specific ideological struggles, such as Carlism and anti-clerical anarchism. The 20th century, however, marked the beginning of a more cohesive movement towards regional autonomy and, in more radical circles, separation within Catalan politics. Notable men of this movement included Francisco Campo and Juan Ventosa, both of whom served as government ministers and worked to found the Regionalist League of Catalonia, otherwise known as Liga. Until the dictatorship, the party was able to make significant gains in restoring the regional autonomy Catalonia had once enjoyed. The suppression of Catalan and the banning of the regional flag under Miguel Primo de Rivera, however, caused Liga to become a minority conservative party, as the ranks of more left-wing factions in Catalonia grew. As I continue this series, I will return to corresponding developments in Catalonia, but for now, let us turn our attention to the Basque Country. The Basque language is one of the oldest languages in Europe and is distinct from much of the continental family. Located in Upper Spain with France along its northern border, the region encompasses Alvara, Guipúzcoa, Vizcaya, and northern Navarra. Some of our earliest accounts of the Basque Country's inhabitants date back as far as the Roman historian Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD. Initially a group of semi-disparate tribes, they gradually united into powerful fiefdoms that were added into the larger kingdom of the Spains. Following the War of Spanish Succession, unlike Catalonia, the realms of the Basque Country retained many of their ancient rights. By the dawn of the 20th century, the region was politically divided, with major cities becoming hotbeds of anarchist trade unions, while the countryside remained committed to protecting the ancient traditions of the church that formed the backbone of their agrarian society. The creation of factories in the larger cities also attracted people from outside the Basque Country, and with them, socialist organizers from other parts of Spain. By 1923, Vizcaya and Guipúzcoa were dominated by left-wing groups, whereas Alvara and Navarra remained largely conservative in their local politics. Like with Catalonia, I will elaborate more on specific details surrounding the Basque Country as the series demands, but for now, I think that this is enough background information. Let us now turn our attention back to Miguel Primo de Rivera and how he grappled with the crisis that faced Spain. As mentioned in the last episode, one of the biggest challenges that faced the Spanish government was the ongoing Rif War in Morocco. Spanish defeats suffered at the hands of Abdul al-Karim's insurgents shattered faith in the government, so putting a swift end to the conflict became one of the first priorities of the dictatorship. In 1925, Miguel organized a joint campaign with French General Henri-Philippe Pétain, and after a series of successful engagements, by September they had forced the surrender of Abdul al-Karim. This victory immediately helped to restore public confidence in the government and the military. Now, had Miguel stepped down here, after leading the country for nearly 4 years, he would be remembered as yet another caudillo, that had righted the ship of state before returning the reins of power to a regular parliamentary government. With the exception of his anti-regionalist policy, Miguel Primo de Rivera's initial reign was overwhelmingly popular as he returned the country from the brink of chaos back to normalcy. Under his leadership, labor relations were stabilized, allowing for economic growth and investment into long overdue public works projects, helping to modernize the country. Rather than relinquish his authority, however, he instead began consolidating his power in an attempt to create a new political order amenable to the majority of Spanish society. To his credit, Miguel's initial push to inaugurate a new regime was met with general public approval. When in 1926 the dictator asked in a plebiscite whether or not the people would support the creation of a new constitution and national assembly, 2/3 of the electorate voted in favor of the proposal, which was then ratified by the king. General public relations were stabilized for the moment, with even the socialist PSOE cooperating in the new government. However, in the outskirts of conventional politics, the radicals of both the right and the left bided their time. Miguel's attempt to cement his regime was also hindered by his refusal to support Catholic trade unions. This alienated the church and, by extension, a good portion of conservative-minded Spaniards that might have otherwise supported his government. Thus, in some ways, it could be argued that Miguel Primo de Rivera's attempt to please every possible sector of Spanish politics, while at the same time distancing himself from core issues like relations with the church and regionalism, left him vulnerable to attack from forces both inside and outside his own government. During the last years of his reign, there were two separate uprisings against the Primo de Rivera regime, with the first being held by the liberals of the Old Cortes in 1926, and the second headed by conservatives in 1929. This discontent from within the establishment also reflected a growing rift between the king and the dictator. Though the elevation of Primo de Rivera did provide an immediate solution to the national crisis that faced Spain in 1923, by the end of the decade, the dictator's extended tenure threatened the credibility of the king as a constitutional monarch and the legitimacy of his royal authority as a whole. So during a cabinet meeting held on December 31st of 1923, when the dictator laid out a series of policies outlining a restoration of full constitutional government and asked for Alfonso XIII's approval, the king refused. In response, Primo de Rivera privately reached out to his circle of high-ranking officers in the military to determine if he still had their confidence. This flagrant circumvention of the king's authority as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, combined with an overall negative reply from the officers, signaled the end of Miguel Primo de Rivera's tenure as dictator. On January 28, 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned, and General Berenguer was appointed by the king to form a new government. After retiring in Paris, the former dictator died in March of that year. Miguel Primo de Rivera's legacy would remain deeply complicated for both sides of Spanish politics. As stated previously, his rule undoubtedly helped to restore order and ensure economic recovery for a country embroiled in crisis. However, by merging all the conventional parties into one institution and then failing to achieve a national consensus, Miguel's withdrawal from political life left a vacuum that radicals quickly exploited. Traditional conservatives and classical liberals that were brought into the regime were now left utterly disorganized following the resignation of the dictator. Socialism, communism, anarchism, and fascism would take the center of political discourse as the old centers of political power struggled to effectively reassert themselves. And that concludes episode 2 of the Spanish Civil War podcast. In the next episode, we'll look at the months that followed the resignation of Miguel Primo de Rivera and examine the shaky foundations of the Second Spanish Republic. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Adios.